Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Of course, you had to tell me something that my wife has reminded me every day since we've been married, that I actually married up. Pakistan and the United States, close allies, often estranged, and often unable to understand each other. What kind of a relationship will we have in the future will depend on our ability to understand what went wrong in the past. Pakistan, of course, was created out of British India in 1947. And it was born in an environment of tremendous insecurity. Right across from Pakistan, just separated by Afghanistan, was the Soviet Union. At that time, for those of us, and I realize that nobody here is old enough to remember that period, but the preoccupation of many people in the world was Soviet expansion. And then Pakistan and India, their parting from one another, I often try to explain to audiences that do not have the nuance and the detailed study of international relations as the worst divorce you know. In fact, shut your eyes for 5 seconds and think of the couple that has had the worst divorce you know and give them both nuclear weapons. And you will have tremendous understanding of the India-Pakistan relationship. The Indians and the Pakistanis simply cannot deal with each other without reference to past grievances. And while they have these grievances that result from partition, the fact remains that they also have a long shared history. So the United States was caught in the middle of it all. The US was looking for an ally in the war against the Soviets, in the Cold War. India wanted to remain non-aligned. Pakistan was looking for a partner, a global partner that would help Pakistan stave off any challenges from India. And so the United States and Pakistan came together, but in my opinion, not necessarily with an understanding of each other's objectives. America was concerned only about communist advances towards the south through Afghanistan into Pakistan and on to India. Pakistan was concerned as much about India as it was about the Soviets. The United States helped build Pakistan's military capability. But quite clearly and rightly so, Pakistan could not have and should not have expected the US to be an ally against India, with whom the United States had its own good relationship. And the nature of the bad divorce was not always understood by Americans, who often look upon the world as a problem to solve, not as a situation to understand. So sometimes the Americans go and say, what's the problem between you two? Why can't we get over it? Well, it's going to take some time to figure it out, and the Americans didn't have the patience to do that. So Pakistan and the US have been allies since Pakistan's independence, but they have often been what Dennis Cox, the famous author on South Asian relations with the US, describes as estranged allies, disenchanted allies, allies that have always had a grievance against the other. Let's begin from the top. Pakistan's grievance. Pakistan was an ally of the United States in the Cold War. Pakistan provided intelligence bases, but the United States did not do, from Pakistan's point of view, what the Pakistanis wanted the US to do in improving their relations with India or helping resolve the outstanding disputes with India, especially the dispute over Jammu and Kashmir. From the American point of view, the US provided Pakistan with military support, and instead of using it purely to build capacity against the communists, Pakistan used it in its war with the Indians in 1965. In 1971, Pakistan was split between Bangladesh and Pakistan, which enhanced Pakistan's feeling of insecurity. Again, there was a tendency in Pakistan, in my opinion wrongly so, to blame the United States for not coming to Pakistan's assistance. The Pakistanis thought they had served as a bridge between the United States and China. Remember Nixon's initiatives towards Mao? In fact, Pakistan served as the bridge, and Kissinger went to China through Pakistan. But Pakistanis were wrong in expecting that the United States will reward them by again coming on their side vis-a-vis the US. And the US officials never took the trouble of explaining this to the Pakistanis at the time. And we moved fast forward. The Soviets came into Afghanistan, and guess what? Again, the desire to solve the problem was more important to the decision makers in Washington than the need to understand the situation. So Pakistan became the staging ground for the war against the Soviets. Now, I don't know how many people in this audience have watched Charlie Wilson's War. And while the movie has what I would call Hollywood license with facts, the fact still remains that it gets it basically right. The US did not care about what the ideology of these people was as long as they fought the communists. As a reporter covering that war, there were occasions when I was a little disturbed by what were then known as the Mujahideen. The word Taliban came much later for the next generation. The Mujahideen would slit some Soviet guy's throat, and they would come back with their head as a trophy. And it used to frighten me that whoever they're doing it to, it's actually, from a humanitarian point of view, not the best of things. We need to call them on this. But nobody did, because at that time, the problem of fighting the communists and the Soviets was being solved. And people with that same ideology from all over the Muslim world, from Morocco to Indonesia, hardline extremists with a very hardline view of religion, which did not, a non-inclusive view of religion, a religion that, a view that divided the world between black and white, instead of understanding that you can have multiple religions, as Muslims throughout history did. These people with a very hardline and narrow vision were allowed to congregate in Pakistan. How did Osama bin Laden end up in that region? He came there for ideology, not because of any territorial relationship with us. So all of these people from all over the world came, and Pakistan ended up becoming the staging ground of the war against the Soviets, which we won. We won it together. But then after winning it, when you have trained tens of thousands of people with jihadist ideology and given them weapons, you need to actually demobilize them, disarm them, and reintegrate them into society. But that wasn't done. The US, from the US point of view again, the business of defeating the Soviet Union was done. Thank you very much. Great victory, adios. And the result was Pakistan was stuck with these people. Some smart Alex in Pakistan came up with the idea that we can actually use and harness the influence of the Mujahideen, who subsequently became the Taliban, into projecting regional influence and even resolving our lack of parity, military parity with India. Well, that hasn't had a very good consequence either. And the result has been the events of Afghanistan falling under Taliban rule, Al-Qaeda having a nexus with the Taliban, and Pakistan becoming relatively unstable as a consequence. And now, for the third time, Pakistan and the United States became allies after 9/11. And again, the alliance was very narrowly constructed. Let us arm the Pakistani military. Let us train or help the Pakistani intelligence service. They will help us take over Afghanistan, help create a new government there. And again, there were people in the United States who started saying, fine, the job is done, let's go away. Well, the good news is that there is some learning from history on both sides. We in Pakistan have been calling upon the United States to take the relationship with Pakistan beyond just a tactical alliance for the issue of the day to a strategic partnership. The United States can have a strategic partnership with India and with Pakistan at the same time. And in fact, Pakistan needs to undergo 3 critical transformations in which the United States needs to show patience and support for the people of Pakistan. What are these transformations? Because of the peculiar history that I just described, Pakistan did not evolve as the democracy that it was intended to evolve as. In fact, 34 of our 62 years as an independent nation have gone under military rule. Coups d'etat and behind-the-scenes manipulation for palace coups has been the norm, rather than the coming in of governments through an election and the removal of governments through an election. Pakistan's first transformation will have to be from this eclectic approach to governance to becoming a stable, consistent democracy. Now, those of you in this audience who are well versed with US history, which, by the way, usually is not the case in big American audiences, because the American tendency towards history is, Joe, he's history. You know, it's a dismissive term. Instead of other countries where people, and the enrollment in history departments, etc., bears testimony to that. So, and Henry Ford, used to say, all history is bunk, which was an attitude as well, which is a wrong attitude, because history helps you understand today and helps you plan for tomorrow. So understanding the history is important. In your own history, you have had many moves that have helped you move towards democracy by understanding the weakness of whatever was happening at the time. So for example, it took you about 40, 50 years before you actually had in presidential elections, instead of the electors doing whatever they liked, you actually started counting the popular vote. Then, getting rid of slavery took another major step. Women didn't get the vote until 1920. And the Civil Rights Act came in 1964. And even now people would argue that American democracy is still a work in progress. You are still improving things. You still have to improve the process. So Pakistani democracy is not going to be perfect from day one. There will be people who will say, oh, well, our politicians are corrupt. Not that they don't say that in America, or do they? I mean, it's interesting. I met an elderly gentleman, a professor of mine and a friend of mine, who said, 5 governors of Illinois in my lifetime have ended up in prison. And as a history buff who first came to I have to tell you this story, by the way, because I just can't resist the temptation. So, I was a young journalist in Pakistan, and I was invited to the US Embassy for Thanksgiving dinner by the ambassador. And after dinner and Thanksgiving, they all decided to play a new game at the time called Trivial Pursuit. And they decided that they are going to really checkmate us poor Pakistani guests and show off their abilities by making us into one team and all the Americans on one team and play the game on American history. Well, guess what? Guess who won? Exactly. So the American ambassador turns to me and says, so how do you know so much about American history? How long have you lived in the US? And I said, sir, I've never even visited the US. He said, how do you know all this? I said, the American Library. You have an air-conditioned library in the city, and it's called the American Library. I come from a poor family. As a kid, I didn't find, I had to go and study somewhere, so I used to go to the American libraries, and every now and then, apart from my textbooks, I'd read all the books available there. I'm the only 17-year-old. By the way, to this day, I'm the only 17-year-old I know who had read the Federalist Papers. And you won't believe this. Recently, I said that in an audience in New York, and there's this gentleman who stood up and he said, gosh, you must have been a really bored child that you had to read. I said, it's one of the greatest documents in your history. And you think the Simpsons are better than that? You allocate time to doing that rather than reading it. But anyway, so going back to lessons from history, American history in itself teaches something about building a democracy. It will be stage by stage. It will be a process of evolution. And knowing American history as well as I do, I keep telling my own countrymen, and I'm very happy to know that one of my country persons is a member of the new class here at the Clinton School for Public Service. But among the Pakistani elite, there is often a misconception that since we have flawed leaders, and sometimes we have corrupt politicians, and sometimes our political parties have problems and this and that, therefore let's throw the baby with the bathwater. It hasn't worked. So this time, Pakistan intends to complete the transformation to democracy, and our military, as an institution, has also decided that instead of just at the first sign of failure or weakness of government, instead of a coup d'etat, they will allow the democratic process to move forward. And there is tremendous support from the Obama administration. I was asked that in my talk I should address what changes is the Obama administration bringing to the US-Pakistan relationship. So the first change they are bringing is the emphasis on democracy. Every time President Obama speaks about Pakistan, he speaks about sustained relationship. This ain't gonna be just, a date. This is, we're still waiting for the ring, but, this is a relationship. This is going to be a partnership, and it's going to be a partnership because of the importance of Pakistan. 160 million people, located in a very important region, the only Muslim majority country with nuclear weapons. It's not a country that can be ignored or should be ignored, and that awareness is coming, and that's a positive. So the first transformation we hope to achieve in Pakistan is from the inability to have democracy to having sustained democracy. The second transformation we hope to achieve is from a culture of militancy and militarism. When you've invested resources in the military, and when you've had all these militants from all over the world congregate in your country, it changes the country's culture. And I'll just give you one example. In 1947, when India and Pakistan both became independent at the same time, out of the same historic tradition, India had a literacy rate of 18%, 1/8. And Pakistan had a literacy rate of 16%, 1/6, 2% difference. Over time, 62 years later, India's literacy rate is 68%, and Pakistan's is either 38 or 48, depending on the definition of literacy. So the 2% difference has become either a 20% difference or a 30% difference. How did that happen? It happened because of lack of investment in Pakistan's education, public education. Because Pakistan had limited resources, and we could use our resources either to build our military capability against our perceived threat from our neighbor, or we could invest it in our people. So in this transformation also, the United States has made a commitment. It is called the Kerry-Lugar Bill. It was originally the Biden-Lugar Bill, named after Senator Joe Biden at that time, who then went on to become vice president. And the idea is very simple. Instead of directing American aid purely at a tactical level at building Pakistan's military capacity, the US will commit $1.5 billion every year. And by the way, don't think it's a lot of money. For 160 million people, who's good at math, calculate, sort of figure it out, But it's still important. It's important for the commitment. $1.5 billion will go towards education, healthcare, and infrastructure building in Pakistan. It will show the people of Pakistan that the US is committed to the people of Pakistan, not just to building a military. It will transform the society. There will be less incentive for poor young people in Pakistan to join the ranks of the Taliban. Because let us be honest, for those who are skeptical about these things, and I know coming to Arkansas, I was briefed, you're talking to fiscal conservatives, man, remember that. Well, it's just a simple fiscal arithmetic. If you're going to have to invest heavily in fortifying Afghanistan and Iraq and keeping your military there for a long time, doesn't it make sense to spend at least a fraction of that money into investing into the people of those countries so that those people become more favorably disposed towards you, understand you better, and have a relationship with you? If this kid, by going to the American Library, which by the way since then has been shut down, could end up learning as much about American history and having the ability to converse with you without attending any American school or college, by the way. Totally educated in Pakistan. Absolutely. But with a passion for learning and books and going to your library, if there could be a replication of that and there could be a few million like that, you would have less to worry about in terms of, so there's one way of dealing with overseas enemies, my fellow friends here and American citizens. One way is by building your military capacity to be able to fight enemies everywhere in the world all at the same time. But the other way is invest a little bit into making less and less people your enemies. Isn't that an easier and a cheaper way of doing it? Win people over. You've got a great country here. This country's greatest assets are its Declaration of Independence, which is the set of principles on which this country is founded. The idea that everybody has the right to the pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those are the values. And then you have a constitution, and then you have a system of governance, with all its flaws, still is perhaps the best system of governance humanity has evolved over the last 5,000 years. Beats monarchy, and certainly the culture of coups d'etat and change of government by assassination. So it's something that, and then your economic system as well, of free enterprise and respect for private property. So these are values that you can share with the world. And I think that the congressional commitment on this, when it materializes in the form of this bill, appropriations bill going through, the House has approved what it calls the Peace Act, the Senate has approved the Kerry-Lugar bill, they're reconciling it. We hope that it will be passed soon. And once it's passed soon, we will have an American commitment for the next 5 years of $1.5 billion every year. If the government of the United States gives that money, the American private sector will also have an incentive to come to Pakistan and also Afghanistan and transform that region. So that is the second part of the transformation. And the third part of the transformation is that Pakistan looks upon its strategic location. How many people have the Pakistani map in their minds? Okay, so the Pakistani map, Pakistan sits at the crossroads of the Middle East. Iran to one side, the Gulf countries just within a couple of 100 miles. Closer, Karachi is closer to Dubai than Washington, D.C. is to Little Rock, especially if you're flying via Memphis, which I had to do this morning. So, and especially if you have to fly back via Chicago, which also I'm doing this afternoon. So, it sits at the crossroads of the oil-rich Gulf, of Central Asia, Afghanistan and beyond, the Stans, and India. And then China is just to the north. So it's a very strategically located country. Now, we could have one attitude in which we say our strategic location puts us at the crossroads of conflicts. There are conflicts in the Middle East, there's conflict in South Asia, there's conflict in Central Asia, there's China and its role, etc. Some people have fears about that. We could try and get into the conflicts of all of those. That's one approach. But you know what? The elected democratic leadership of Pakistan has a different vision. Benazir Bhutto, who was our leader and who was assassinated by the terrorists, and whose husband has now taken over as president, she had a vision. In fact, she has a book called Reconciliation, which some of you may or may not have seen. It's a good book. I helped write it, so it can't be that bad. And that book basically lays out this whole scenario. After defeating Nazi Germany, what did the United States do? It didn't go into a vanquished country and sort of, beat its chest. It helped rebuild that country. Japan, the Marshall Plan, I don't know how many people remember that. And the idea was to build society, and guess what? Germany is now an American partner and an economic powerhouse in the world. So our region can also be similarly transformed. We look forward to close and friendly relations with India, while keeping the room open for discussions and negotiations about all the issues that we have had with them. You can't move forward in building a positive relationship when you have had a negative one by ignoring the outstanding issues. But you need to address them. We will address them. Important thing is the basic outlook and vision is different. It's no longer to believe in the notion of a permanent enemy. It's about looking upon our strategic location as a crossroads of opportunity. Pakistan can be the country through which pipelines for oil and gas to India will pass. Pakistan will be the great trading nation through which trade for Central Asia will go. Central Asia is by and large landlocked. They don't have access to the sea except either through Iran, through us, or towards the north through the Soviet Union. Well, guess what? Soviet ports are far. We are closer from most Central Asian countries. So that is the third transformation we intend to effect. The Obama administration has appointed Ambassador Richard Holbrooke, an experienced diplomat, as the responsible person for relations with Afghanistan and Pakistan. Not only is he an experienced man who brings a lot of knowledge and ability, but he also invests time. And the fact that there is somebody devoted to our part of the country reminds me of the saying by Mae West that I'd rather be looked over than be overlooked. So Pakistan and Afghanistan are now not being overlooked, and that is an important thing. There's somebody, and there are some people in the US government, and that is a positive that the Obama administration has effected for us. Second is the Kerry-Lugar bill, which I hope will be passed. The third is an initiative that is still stuck in Congress, and things do get stuck in the American Congress. I have great admiration for that institution, but every now and then things do get stuck there for various reasons. And so I hope that we will be able to overcome those. And that is the initiative to create something called Reconstruction Opportunity Zones for Afghanistan and the troubled border areas between Afghanistan and Pakistan, where it will be easier for Americans to invest so that the young people there end up making boxer shorts for Walmart rather than making improvised explosive devices for the Taliban. Give them a future, give them hope, give them a job, and that will come through that initiative of American investment. I was also asked to try and address the question of US military presence in Afghanistan and how it affects us, and also the question of US military airstrikes in our region. Well, first of all, let us say that the US military presence in Afghanistan is a direct consequence of the events of 9/11. Americans didn't want to go there. I mean, I was only a few minutes ago, I was complaining about the fact that you guys walked away from there. So I have a very realistic understanding of that. You didn't go there because you wanted to. Afghanistan is not a picnic. You're not there for fun. You're there to do a job. You want to make sure that Afghanistan does not remain in any way a base or a staging area for international or global terrorism. That said, in the long term, stability in that region will come by strengthening Afghan institutions, an Afghan national army, Afghan national police, and a democratic Afghan government. We look forward to working together as the democratic government of Pakistan with the democratic government of Afghanistan. Military strikes, of course, we have had problems in the in Afghanistan as well as on the Pakistani side. Although the US does not have direct military strikes, we have what are known as Predator drone strikes, because these are essentially surveillance planes that sometimes use missiles to take out specific targets that come on their screen. We believe that Pakistan has a stable and a strong government. It may not be as stable as people want it, but we have strong institutions. We are not Somalia, or we are not somewhere where there is no state, there is no army, there is no police. No, we have a large army. We have one of the largest armies in the world. We have a military capability. We have institutions. Those institutions need to be strengthened and made effective. And instead of foreign troops coming into Pakistan and thereby creating a new problem of resistance to foreigners, Pakistan will deal with all possible targets that are related to international terrorism and their support networks through its means. And so Pakistan would rather have the Americans share intelligence, technology, and work together. And I think we are on the way to doing that. The Pakistani, the American, and the NATO and Afghan forces are now engaged in a cooperative effort. We think that, by the way, there is a cultural dimension to virtually everything. And I'll just give you an example. Does anyone remember the famous incident when American troops ended up by mistake bombing what was essentially a wedding party in Afghanistan? Well, what happened? Whoever is watching that video or that feed from these planes that are conducting surveillance, they see these guys going around, firing in the air, sort of jumping around, and they immediately think these must be menacing individuals, not realizing that that particular tribe celebrates weddings in that way. So if there was somebody who was Afghan and fully aware of the cultural dimension sitting and watching that, they would have said, just a minute, move that, let's see that. Oh, okay, that looks like the bridal party. That looks like, maybe we should check it a little bit more on ground. And it didn't happen that way. So we think that all action on the Pakistani side of the border would be far more effective if it is conducted with full participation of Pakistan. And we are in the process of removing any doubts, fears, concerns, and suspicions that have dogged the relationship in the past. I'll be very candid. You know, I'm trying to do an experiment these days. I was a professor before I became ambassador, and I was joking with people that I'm doing an experiment these days of how you can actually, you know the classic definition of a diplomat? A diplomat is a man who's sent abroad to lie for his country. I said, well, I'm going to turn it on its head, and I'm going to show how you can actually be a successful diplomat with candor. So then I can actually teach a course afterwards called Candor in Diplomacy. And so I'm very candid. I mean, we have had problems in which Americans have had fears and concerns which occasionally spill over into newspapers about sympathy for the Taliban within Pakistan and how that sometimes undermines American military efforts, etc. The government of Pakistan now is addressing that. We've seen military action that is sustained, and it will remain sustained. We have had success in Swat. We had more than 2 million people become refugees as a result of that. People willingly left their homes so that they would not be made into human shields by the Taliban. We will fight the Taliban and defeat them, and we will do that with American support. But at the same time, we hope that the Americans will understand that the lead role in our region should belong to us for the simple reason that we know the region better, it's our home, and we have now decided that we will fight this war for our sake. The more our previous leaders said, we are fighting terrorists because America is telling us to do so, the fewer people in Pakistan supported the war effort. USA Today only last week had 2 graphs. One of how people in Pakistan felt according to opinion polling in July 2008, just when the democracy in Pakistan was new and our new president had not yet been elected, and how they feel now in July 2009. Guess what? Only 33% of the population at that time felt that Pakistan needs to fight the Taliban with full vigor and make that the primary fight. 83% of Pakistanis now want Pakistan to fight the Taliban for the sake of Pakistan. That is the democracy dividend. Under General Musharraf, because the people were not sure of their own government and its intentions, now people feel that our own government, at least it's their elected government, whether some people like it or not, there are people who have reservations, and I'll be candid on that as well. There are parts of Pakistan where popularity varies, but that happens in this country too. You know, you have the red states and the blue states and all that. We have that similar phenomenon in Pakistan with certain regions voting a certain way and certain others voting certain other ways. All of that is true. But the people of Pakistan now realize that they don't want their children to live in a country where some people kill people for not growing a beard, kill people for not putting their women or not wrapping up their women in a certain way, blow up women's schools because they don't want girls to study. We envision a Pakistan of equal opportunities for men and women, a Pakistan that is part of the world while retaining its Muslim and its Islamic identity and its culture, and yet benefiting from all the processes of globalization that the rest of the world is benefiting from. And we will not focus on conflict, but on understanding with all our neighbors as well as with friends like the United States. So that is the lay of the land as I see it. I'm told that there's going to be questions and answers, and I'm sure there will be a lot that you will ask me that will enable me to move the discussion forward. Thank you all for being such patient listeners.
I'm Patrick Kennedy. I direct the speaker series here. We have time for a few questions. There are 2 mics roaming around. Please raise your hand and wait for the mic, and I will direct you. We'll start with you right there. Doctor, did you have one, Dr. Nunn?
Our university is the recipient of some of Mr. Obama's initiative. We've got 30 Pakistani youth coming from the Fatah region who will age 18 to 25. They will be here for 7 weeks, and I would extend an invitation to anybody in this group who would like to have them for dinner or to host them for a week in their home while we are here. And also the State Department is sending us 10 state and local government officials in about a year. So we're looking forward to the opportunity to get acquainted with Pakistan firsthand.
Well, thank you very much for accepting these visitors. It's very important. Let me just say one thing. In 1990, the United States cut off aid to Pakistan under an amendment to the Foreign Aid Act called the Pressler Amendment. The Pressler Amendment was one of those well-meaning things that ended up having adverse and negative consequences. I mean, well-meaning from certain points of view. We never thought it was well-meaning. It wanted to stop Pakistan from developing nuclear weapons. Now, nations don't develop nuclear weapons because somebody, you know, it's not like a James Bond movie with Dr. Evil deciding something out of the blue. Nuclear weapons and military policy are determined by strategic and regional and whatever considerations. So instead of doing that, they just said, nothing going to Pakistan, exchanges all stopped, etc., etc. So you can imagine, for 19 years or 18 years, Pakistan's young soldiers have had very little exposure to the US. Very few students from Pakistan have been in the United States. And as a result, the munificence and benevolence of the American people is something that Pakistanis, and consider one more fact, 60% of Pakistan's population is below the age of 28. So these are young, it's a young population. So the young people, it's your opportunity to, and thank you very much for having them at this university, it's the opportunity to show the Pakistanis that Americans don't have horns, as Osama bin Laden paints them, that the Americans don't covet anybody else's territory. Oil they have a little bit of a problem with, but they'll get, but they pay for it, albeit, you know, whatever the price, and stuff like that. So Americans don't really mean ill to the world, and that's a message you can only give to people when you interact with them. And that is why the administration has taken this huge initiative. We have had several military officers come. You won't believe this. I had a group of 36 come yesterday to my embassy, and including people from FATA. Now, FATA stands for Federally Administered Tribal Areas. This is the very remote part that borders Afghanistan. Just to tell you the remoteness of it, one part of it is called Waziristan, where male literacy figures are 17% and female literacy figures are 3%. So how can these people fully understand or comprehend anything? They just listen to the radio broadcast or propaganda by the Taliban or whoever else and saying, you know what, the United States just wants to fight and kill all Muslims, and then they say, oh no, we don't want our faith to die, so they stand up, and you know, it's a lot of propaganda. And that can only be combated by showing something. You know, you can't have a radio station for radio stations competing match. You have to show. So these people are going to be instrumental in changing hearts and minds there. So the people who came yesterday to the embassy, I asked them, how many of you had a negative impression of the United States before you came here? Out of 36, 32 hands went up. I said, okay, now you've been here 3 weeks. How many of you have a positive impression? Guess how many hands went up? 36. So such programs are important for that reason.
Stephen.
Ambassador Haqqani, Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam.
Thank you very much for coming here. I'm a native Pakistani, but this is my adopted country. And I'm one of the first adjunct faculty of Clinton School. Walter, we'll get together on those students. Thank you very much. You've actually answered all the questions that I had here. But would you...
Make up a new one.
Yeah, I am. I am going to make a new one. You know, recently we've heard in the news, and maybe this audience will benefit from the fact that our judiciary became independent through the efforts of the civil society. Now there's been talk about lawsuits and stuff against President Musharraf, who was considered an ally of the United States during the Bush administration. Would you talk a little bit about that? And a second question, short one. Mohtarama Benazir Bhutto was here some times ago, and she gave us the honor of meeting the Pakistani community. We have a sizable community here. I wish you would spend some time with the community as well.
I would love to be able to come and visit with the Pakistani community here on a future visit. Unfortunately, today I just have to rush back. You know that this was scheduled for May once and then had to be cancelled because we had tripartite negotiation, then President Karzai ended up in Washington, D.C. and all that. So we will plan that. So the second part is easy to answer. The first part, the judiciary in Pakistan, look, it's not just the judiciary. Pakistan's media has become much freer than before. Sometimes we get upset with it because, it's just too free and too diverse. But it's important. It's part of the opening up of a society where a single version of history, a single version of events, an ideological construct has been served to the people over years. Pluralism is going to benefit Pakistan. And in a pluralist democracy, a strong judiciary is very, very important. Pakistani civil society stood up for a strong judiciary. We are happy that our judiciary is asserting itself within the framework of our constitution. That said, it's important to understand that nations in transition have to make choices between accepting and acknowledging the principle for the future and settling scores from the past. And if one is going to undermine the other, then that is something where I think everybody needs to exercise judiciousness. I will not comment specifically on any action or decision of the judiciary. All I will say is that Pakistan needs to move forward under constitutional under its constitutional principles and with the rule of law. And our parliament, our judiciary, our media, and the executive branch of government all have to abide by law as circumscribed by the constitution for each one.
Next question. You back there, ma'am. Wait for the mic.
Hi, you talk a lot about education, how it's important, and you talked about how the U.S. is helping and how other governments and NGOs are helping, but what is the Pakistani government doing for education, especially primary school, because the literacy rates are really low, so just wondering.
Well, the allocation of resources in Pakistan, and actually when you talk about, what the contribution is, because when you're talking to an American audience, you have to tell them where their tax dollars are going. So that's the reason why it's the focus. Otherwise, if I was talking to a Pakistani audience, I'd tell them where their tax dollars, which by the way aren't that many anyway, because very few people in Pakistan are paying tax, as you know, a major issue. So the plan for for education in Pakistan is to double the resources that Pakistan allocates, both foreign and internal, for primary education. At the moment, we spend something close to 2.5% of our GDP on education, which is very small. And if it goes up to 5%, that will in itself be a major undertaking. At the same time, as we move along, this will have to be a multi-year process. That's why I use the word transformation. Transformations take years. It will be, the goal should be universal literacy and 100% enrollment of children, school-going age children in school. It's a sad reality that in South Asia, 98% of school-going age children go to school in Sri Lanka, 96% of school-going age children go to school in Bangladesh, 92% school-going age children go to school in India, 92 in India, and only 58% in Pakistan. So the room is enormous, and it can only be, the requirement can only be met by providing public schooling at the primary level. The government intends to double the expenditure on public schooling in all 4 provinces and the federally administered tribal areas. And we are also investing in teacher training, because you cannot have new schools without adequately trained school teachers.
Question, back there.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm also one of the Pakistani Americans, and he did not ask us to ask all the questions. Thank you, Ambassador, for coming to Little Rock. My question is just the continuation of the last question. As you pointed out, that GDP expenditure of Pakistani government on education is just over 2%. And most of the problem is that Pakistan's military is almost focusing on their neighbors, especially India. What could be the role of American government to resolve this problem and get our expenditure, the Pakistani expenditure down to the levels where they can spend on health and education?
I think any role that the US government and any other friend of Pakistan around the world plays in ensuring that Pakistan and its neighbors get along much better and there's a lesser security threat perception in Pakistan than has dominated our discourse for the last 60 years is going to be helpful. But that said, I think, just as the young lady said, what is going to happen in Pakistan on education rather than what the world is going to do, similarly, the real question is, how soon can Pakistanis as a society start understanding that the social indicators and the problems associated with them are as important, if not more important, than the threat perception that Pakistanis have carried for the last 60 years. Because let us be honest, as somebody who has always argued that we need better relations with our neighbors and has often been criticized for saying that back home, you will agree with me that to be able to make those bold decisions needs public support. The reason why our military is able to fight the Taliban in Swat today is because there is greater support to fight the Taliban. Similarly, I think, and this is something Pakistani civil society does not always fully act upon, that instead of just focusing your guns on what's wrong with government and governance, you also need to focus on what's wrong with the discourse in society. Why is it that Pakistanis are so focused on external threats and not as focused on domestic concerns and literacy concerns? Why are our TV shows, for example, are always about all the I mean, I'm sure you get by satellite, almost every Pakistani in America now does, all the Pakistani TV channels. Why are they always going on? And there are only two things that happen, either criticism of the government or criticism of America or India or Afghanistan. Well, if that is the only discourse and debate and discussion in the country, when will somebody, I mean, like the statistic I told you about only 58% Pakistani school-going age children going to school, why is that not the focus of discussion of any of the so many shows that these famous anchor persons in Pakistan have now launched? So I think it's a two-way street. It's not just the government and it's not just the United States that's going to help change our patterns of military spending. Pakistani society, if it stops being concerned about the threat to Pakistan, first of all, we have to deal with the real threats. Then there is the perception of threat. And as long as there is a perception of threat, there will always be an initiative and an incentive for military spending. And for a country with a limited economic base, to spend heavily on building military capacity will inevitably weaken our capacity to invest in our society, in our healthcare, and in our education. So it's a classic choice. And that choice can only come about with the people of Pakistan waking up and saying, you know what, maybe we need to stop worrying so much about external threats that we keep inevitably increasing our military spending. And we need to have a minimum deterrent, which we do have, and beyond that, we need to stop focusing only on one dimension. It's like a family that is constantly acquiring weapons to protect itself, and at the same time is kind of, losing the levels of nutrition at home. And so we really need to think about it. Maybe we need to deal with the threat as well as dealing with the attitude about that threat. And the international community's cooperation, you know that we have made progress with India in meetings between our prime ministers in Sharm el-Sheikh, but we also have to deal with the people within our country who keep saying that, this is an eternal animosity that we cannot do away with. I think we need to overcome that as well. And now I'd like a question from somebody other than the Pakistanis in the audience, because this is a dining table conversation from home brought into a public arena. Let others come into it as well.
This is the last question, too, here.
I usually get the last question, and it will not be from home. My question is that what you have said, out of my culture, I would say amen to everything that you've said. But the question, I think that this audience, when you look at the capacity of this audience, I think it reflects a hunger for an absence that we've had in our public education, world history. As we're going through educational reform, how would you recommend to the Commissioner of Education, Secretary of Education, that world history be put back as a requirement because of the technology that is exposed to us, that this is a global world that all of us can participate. But as a professor, you have to have a curriculum that directs that education. Would that be one of the recommendations you'd have to the president?
I wish I was here only as a professor, in which case I'd just go forth and give a whole set of recommendations. As ambassador, it's not appropriate for me to advise another country that I'm ambassador to what they should teach their kids. But in general terms, let me say that all countries, especially countries with advanced economic standing in the world, with the position of leadership in the world, that they actually have an obligation to try and diversify the knowledge base of their young people. And that it is sad that in recent surveys it has turned out that even after 7 years of America having shed blood in Iraq, only 19% of college students can pinpoint Iraq on a map. It is sad. And as I say, if the country is worth shedding blood for, it's certainly worth knowing where the heck it is, and it's definitely worth knowing how to pronounce its name. And that's all I would say.